Okay, so I think we all know that everyone in the UK has been just a little bit on edge lately about energy prices.
Yeah, just a little bit.
It seems to be a topic that just keeps coming up.
Yeah, definitely top of mind for a lot of people.
Today, we're going to crank up that anxiety just a little bit more because we're going to talk about how the UK very narrowly avoided a nationwide blackout.
Oh, yeah, this was
Like by a hair's breadth.
big news.
Yeah, and not exactly what you want to hear when you're already a little bit stressed about your next heating bill, is it?
It definitely adds a whole new layer of concern, doesn't it, to the whole conversation?
It really does, and it's a perfect backdrop for our deep dive today because we're looking at this opinion piece from SourceName,
Right.
which was published just as the UK narrowly avoided these rolling blackouts.
Yeah, the timing couldn't be more perfect.
The timing is impeccable.
Yeah.
So let's unpack this whole blackout situation because I'll admit I'm still a bit fuzzy on some of the details.
Sure. So to really understand what happened, we need to go back to date at specific time.
Right.
This is when the demand for electricity hit a peak.
Okay.
As temperatures plummeted, the temperature.
Oh, so it got cold.
It got really cold, and at the same time, the wind output, and remember the UK relies very heavily on wind power,
We do.
fell to just percentage capacity.
So not much wind.
Not a lot of wind. So what happened was this created a massive energy shortfall of amount megawatts.
Wow.
This is a huge number, and this forced the national grid to scramble to find other energy sources.
Okay, so just to recap, everyone's cranking up their heating as it's freezing outside.
Yeah.
The wind decides to take a break, and suddenly we're like right on the edge of a blackout.
Yeah. Wait.
So what happened next?
Well, this is where it gets even more interesting. Because to prevent a complete blackout, they had to activate what is called the Viking interconnector.
I've heard of this.
Yeah.
What is that?
This is basically a really, really long high-voltage cable that runs under the North Sea.
Oh, wow.
And it allows the UK to import electricity from Denmark.
So it's like our emergency power line to the continent.
Exactly.
Like a lifeline for the UK grid.
Exactly. It's like a lifeline, and it really shows just how desperate the situation had become.
It sounds like it.
They really were, because the article mentions that the UK was buying power at 50 times the normal rate.
50 times.
50 times the normal rate.
Just to keep the lights on.
Just to keep everything running.
Gosh.
And even with all of these emergency measures, we only avoided blackouts because 2 power stations failed.
Oh.
But luckily for the UK, they failed after the peak demand had passed.
So it was just pure luck.
It was a very, very lucky coincidence.
Imagine if like your power went out
Right.
and you're trying to explain to someone on a Zoom call like, sorry, the whole country has just gone dark.
Yeah, well,
It's not just me.
luckily they didn't have to deal with that.
We dodged a bullet.
Yeah, they definitely dodged a bullet.
But the author doesn't just see this as a one-off incident, right?
No, they don't.
They tie this into like a much bigger conversation about the UK's energy policy.
They're using this close call to critique the UK's commitment to net zero emissions by 2050.
Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, can you remind us what net zero is exactly?
Yeah, so reaching net zero means achieving a balance between the amount of greenhouse gases that we emit and the amount we remove from the atmosphere.
Okay.
So it's about balancing what we put out and what we take out.
Okay, so how does the author link this near blackout to this net zero?
They argue that relying on wind and solar power makes the grid vulnerable.
Okay.
Because these sources of energy are what are called intermittent by nature.
Okay.
You can't always rely on the wind blowing or the sun shining.
Right.
So when you have a situation like this where demand surges and those sources aren't readily available, that's when you have a problem.
So their point is, if we're aiming for net zero, which means relying heavily on renewables, how can we be sure that we have a stable energy supply when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining?
Exactly. That's exactly their point. And what's fascinating is they actually see this whole near blackout as part of a larger pattern in UK politics.
Oh, well.
They argue that controversial policies, things like lockdowns and quantitative easing, are often pushed through with very little dissent.
Right.
Until a real-world crisis forces people to change their thinking.
So they're saying net zero might be another example of a policy that is being championed without fully considering the potential downsides.
Exactly, until something like this blackout happens and then everyone starts to question it.
And then suddenly everyone's like, oh,
yeah,
maybe we didn't think this through.
Should we have done this differently?
Yeah, and I noticed that the author specifically calls out Ed Miliband.
Right.
It seems like he's become a bit of a symbol for this whole push towards renewables in the UK.
Yeah, he gets a lot of attention for this, doesn't he?
He does.
And it's true, he was very involved early on in advocating for renewable energy. However, the author does acknowledge that net zero didn't actually become official policy until Theresa May's conservative government.
Right. So it's not just a Labour Party initiative.
No, it's not. It's something that both parties support.
Okay, so both parties are on board with this, which makes it even more interesting that the author claims so few politicians are actually raising concerns.
Exactly, and they even go so far as to mention the Reform Party as the only party who is actually challenging this net zero plan.
Wow. So
It's a pretty bold statement.
yeah, it's a pretty bold statement, and they're really questioning why there isn't more open debate and dissent about a policy that could have such significant implications, especially after we just had this close call with a nationwide blackout.
Yeah, and they're saying that it's not just a few people who are worried about this. They're saying that a lot of people are starting to question whether or not this was the right move.
Right, and they're saying that maybe it's time to step back and have a conversation about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, I think this is a great place to take a quick break.
Sounds good. It's interesting how the author connects this whole energy debate to a much broader critique of how the government's handling lots of complex issues.
Yeah, I was wondering about that.
They keep using this phrase, establishment thinking.
What does that even mean?
Well, it sounds a bit vague, doesn't it?
It does.
But I think what they're getting at is that the government is too focused on just following conventional wisdom,
Right.
like sticking with the status quo even when it might not be the best way to go.
So they're basically saying that the government is prioritizing ideology over being practical.
Yeah, and they're worried that this is going to lead to even bigger problems down the road.
And they point to this near blackout as a prime example.
Exactly, like a warning sign of what could happen if we keep going down this path.
So they're not just talking about energy policy, they're talking about like a whole way of thinking.
Right, and they point to other areas where they see this happening, like education, the economy, immigration, and free speech.
It's a pretty bleak picture they're painting. And they even go so far as to predict a major crisis.
Yeah, like this near blackout was just a taste of things to come.
And that a crisis is inevitable unless the government changes course.
Exactly. They even say, it will be through the kind of disaster we narrowly avoided on Wednesday night. Ed Miliband will be for the chop, and everyone will be saying, why aren't we building more gas and nuclear?
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
But they don't really offer any specific solutions, do they?
No, not really. It's more like they're raising the alarm and hoping that someone will listen.
Right, but what's interesting is that they keep coming back to this idea of a lack of critical thinking and dissent within the government.
Oh, yeah. They definitely think that there's too much groupthink going on.
And not enough people who are willing to challenge the status quo.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point because if you don't have people who are willing to question things and think outside the box, then you're going to end up making the same mistakes over and over again.
And they seem to believe that if we had more diverse perspectives in government and more people willing to consider ideas that maybe aren't so conventional.
Yeah, unconventional ideas.
Then we might end up with policies that are more effective and more robust.
Exactly, because you're bringing in more ideas, more viewpoints, and that can only lead to better decision making.
And it's interesting how they connect this whole critique of government thinking to a personal assessment of Keir Starmer's leadership.
Yeah, they definitely see his leadership style as a reflection of the bigger problems they're identifying.
Right, they describe him as leaden and unresponsive.
Yeah.
And they criticize his tendency to just dismiss criticism and focus on attacking his opponents rather than actually engaging in like a constructive dialogue.
They say, this is what has made us all sit through a 6-month masterclass in how to destroy the image of the country, crush the economy, and alienate people who might have given him a chance.
Oh, that's harsh.
It's a pretty strong statement.
It is a strong statement.
But I think it highlights their point that the quality of leadership really matters.
Because they're saying that Starmer's leadership style is making the problems worse.
Right. He's not addressing the problems, he's exacerbating them.
Yeah, so it seems like their concern isn't just with specific policies, but with like the whole political culture.
Right.
And the people who are shaping that culture.
Yeah, and while they don't really give us like a step-by-step plan for change, I think what they're suggesting is that we need a shift in mindset.
Right.
And a more open approach to dialogue and dissent.
So more open conversation.
Yeah, more open conversation.
More willingness to consider different viewpoints.
Exactly. And that could be essential for overcoming the challenges that the UK is facing.
So, if the author is this pessimistic about the government and their approach, Is there any hope for the future, or are we just doomed?
Well, they do hint at a potential path forward,
Okay.
but it's not exactly a comforting one.
No.
They suggest that real change might only come about through a major upheaval,
Like a shakeup of the whole system.
Yeah, like something that forces everyone to reevaluate their priorities.
So are they talking about another energy blackout and economic collapse?
They don't really specify what they mean,
Okay.
but they do mention the Conservative Party and the Reform Party as potential agents of change.
Okay, so they're putting their faith in those parties.
It seems like it.
So let's say for a moment that the author's right and this major crisis is on the horizon.
Okay.
What can we as individuals do to prepare ourselves?
Well, I don't think you need to start stockpiling canned goods or anything like that.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's always a good idea to be prepared for unexpected events, and a big part of that is staying informed.
Okay, so stay informed.
Yeah, read articles, listen to podcasts, talk to people who know more than you do.
Right.
Just stay engaged with what's going on.
But it's hard not to feel a bit helpless. When you hear these predictions about the future.
I know what you mean.
Like, what can one person do?
Well, I think it's important to remember that individual actions can make a difference,
Okay.
especially when they're combined with collective action.
What do you mean by collective action?
Well, it could involve supporting organizations that are working on the issues you care about.
Right.
Getting involved in political activism, or even just talking to your friends and family about these topics.
Right. So raising awareness.
Exactly. The more we talk about these things, the more awareness we raise, and the more likely it is that we'll find solutions together.
That's a good point, because it's easy to feel isolated when you're facing these big, complex problems.
Yeah,
But we're all in this together.
we are.
And if we can find ways to connect with each other and work together, then we can create a more positive future.
Absolutely, even in the face of challenges.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important takeaway from this whole discussion, that even though the UK is facing some serious challenges,
Yeah.
and there are reasons to be concerned about the future, there's also reason for hope.
There is.
Because ultimately, the future isn't predetermined. It's something that we create together through our choices and actions.
That's a really empowering way to think about it.
Yeah, it is. It's like we have the power to shape our own destiny.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about this near blackout and this pretty scathing critique of the government's approach to energy and so much more.
Yeah, we have.
I feel a little overwhelmed, honestly. Like, where do we even go from here?
Well, I think the main takeaway is we really need to think critically about the choices that we're making as a country when it comes to energy.
Okay.
The author is really urging us to think about balancing energy security with affordability and our environmental goals.
Right, because we can't just ignore climate change
Right.
and the need to find cleaner energy sources, but we also can't have the lights going out,
Yeah.
every
right.
time the wind stops blowing.
Exactly.
So what is the solution?
Yeah, well, the author doesn't really give us like a concrete plan,
Okay.
but they do seem to favor a more pragmatic approach,
Okay.
one that prioritizes keeping the lights on and making sure energy is affordable, even if it means maybe slowing down this transition to renewables a little bit.
And they mentioned building more gas and nuclear plants.
Yeah.
Is that realistic?
Well, those are definitely options that are being talked about right now.
Okay.
Gas plants, they're relatively quick to build, and they can provide a pretty reliable source of energy.
Okay.
And nuclear power is really efficient, and it produces very little in the way of carbon emissions.
But gas is still a fossil fuel.
You're right. It is. And nuclear power has its own challenges, with safety and waste disposal.
So it seems like every option has pros and cons.
Yeah.
So how do we even weigh those and make informed decisions?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it?
It is.
There's no one perfect solution.
Yeah.
There's no single energy source that's going to solve all of our problems.
Okay.
It's about finding the right mix of sources to meet our needs in a way that is both sustainable and affordable.
And that requires a lot of conversation,
Yeah.
a lot of open and honest debate,
It does.
considering all the different viewpoints and probably a lot of compromise.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this brings us back to the author's critique of the government's approach. They seem to want more critical thinking, more dissent, more willingness to just challenge the way things are.
Yeah, and how do we put that into action?
That's the question, isn't it?
It is.
It's not just about energy. It's about how we make decisions as a society,
Absolutely.
about the role of experts, giving more space to dissenting voices and just finding ways to have those tough conversations and make those difficult choices together.
I'm starting to think of this piece less as doom and gloom and more as a call to action.
Oh, interesting.
Like, wake up, people. We need to start thinking critically, and we need to demand more from our leaders.
So what can our listeners do to make a difference?
Well, first, you have to be aware. you know?
Okay.
Educate yourself about the different energy sources, the challenges, and the potential solutions.
Read articles, listen to podcasts like this one.
Exactly.
Talk to experts.
Yes.
Don't be afraid to ask questions.
Challenge assumptions.
Yeah.
Demand evidence. These are decisions that affect all of us.
Right.
We have a right to be informed and to make our voices heard.
And it's not just about being heard publicly. It's about having these conversations with your family, at the pub, with your colleagues.
Yeah, the more we talk about these things, the more we normalize these conversations and the more likely we are to find solutions.
Yeah. It's easy to feel powerless when you're dealing with these big problems.
Yeah.
But we're not alone in this.
We're not.
And by working together, by having these conversations, by demanding more from our leaders, we can build a future that is sustainable and prosperous.
Absolutely. And even though this is the end of our deep dive, the conversation doesn't have to end here.
Right.
Keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep talking about these issues.
We've covered a lot today. It's a lot to take in, but I hope this has given you some things to think about, some new ideas, and most importantly, that you stay engaged in this conversation about UK energy.
Yeah, because it affects all of us.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, everyone.